So together with our sister centers, meaning the Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, under the aegis of the new Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and in collaboration with the Center for Chinese Studies, so this has been a really big collaborative effort, we have organized a series of initiatives around the suggestive and somewhat tongue-in-cheek observation that many of the big events, right, that we tend to commemorate have tended to take place at decades' ends, right? So you have 1789 in France, 1929 in New York, and of course around the world, 1949 in China, 1979 in Iran and Afghanistan, and the list could go on, and it does go on because we came up with a whole bunch of others. Hence the title, right, of this whole series, The Nines, brings cusps and perceptions of possibility, from 1789 to 2009. Obviously, these nines were not all about the spread of democracy. Many, of course, were not that at all. But they all constituted moments in which political imagination ran wild, arising from the possibilities opened, right, by fissures in local and global structures. And these structures were changed in turn by these events in often unexpected ways, all the while reshaping, often I would say taming, the wild imaginings that have been spawned at these decades' ends. So of course no nine is closer to the mission of our centers and also more vivid in our collective and indeed in many cases personal, very personal sometimes, memories than 1989. And who can better examine the hopes gained and lost in that fateful year than today's speaker? So it is such an honor, really, to have Professor Markovits inaugurate this series, and indeed our reflections on the possibilities and limitations of social and political change, of historical change in general. Andrei Markovits is Arthur Thurnall Professor and Karl Deutsch Collegiate Professor of Comparative Politics and German Studies, of course, here at University of Michigan. And he is the author and editor of many books and articles on an astonishing variety of topics, from German and Austrian politics to the social and cultural roots of anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. He has also worked extensively on comparative sports culture, especially soccer, in Europe and North America. Professor Markovits' latest book, Uncouth Nation, Why Europe Dislikes America, published by Princeton University Press in 2007, has been translated into Italian, Korean, and German. He is also a fellow dog lover. I say that with pride, so much so that he's now working on a project entitled, I think, beautiful title, The New Discourses of Dogs, not on dogs. That's incorrect. That's, I mean, I got it. I mean, I think I got it. I mean, what would life be without dogs, right? And also, and of course, he's also an amazing teacher and lecturer. He received the 2007 Golden Apple Award, among many other recognitions. So it's hard to imagine a more exciting and expert guide for us through the complex origins and legacies of that fall, right, of 20 years ago. So his talk today is titled 1989, a 20-year balance sheet of that Annus Mirabilis. So please welcome Andrei Markovits.
Thank you very much. This is blame it on the California sun. When Dario's email reached me in the heaven of Stanford, everything looked good, and of course I immediately said, "Yeah, I'll do this. Why not? I can, give a talk on this topic." And little did I know that actually there are, of course, many, many more qualified people in our faculty who really should be here, because as Dario so kindly already mentioned, I've spent my last few years worrying about the new discourse of dogs, writing books on sports and various other things, and actually not doing any research on the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. But I hope you'll indulge me in this. So thank you very much, and it's your charm and the California sun. Were a Martian to have gazed down to Earth in the early fall of 1989, he would have found the following map. One Soviet Union, one Yugoslavia, one Czechoslovakia, and two Germanys. There were 38 independent states in what we consider the political geographic region of Europe at the time. If the same Martian were to look down on Europe in the fall of 2009, he would find no Soviet Union, no Yugoslavia, no Czechoslovakia, and one Germany. He would find more than 50 independent states comprising the region called Europe, which of course is not quite clear in the first place as to where it ends and where its boundaries of all sorts, cultural, political, geographic, ethnic, really lie. And this vagueness, I would suggest, pertains only to this continent's eastern boundaries, never its western ones. Nobody doubts that Iceland or Norway belong solidly to Europe, even if not the European Union, which is irrelevant in the context of this assignation. But there's a huge debate as to whether Turkey is Europe, the Caucasus states might be Europe, Russia maybe is Europe, etc., etc. Someone actually suggested that Europe include everything from Portugal to Vladivostok. Indeed, in terms of the world of sports, soccer in this case, and a few other international dimensions, Israel belongs to Europe. Only, of course, because its Arab neighbors exclude it completely, not because the Europeans accept the Israelis or Israel as European in any way. They most assuredly do not. The West European consensus of coolness towards, irritation with, and downright hostility to Israel, in notable contrast, by the way, to East European consensus, which is much more favorable. Some interesting data on this, but I'm not going to talk about this here, would really entail a lecture all its own, which again I will not give here. Suffice it to say that the where Europe begins and ends issue has not at all been changed by the Annus Mirabilis of 1989. If anything, it has been intensified. I think it was the great Habsburg statesman Count Metternich who said that Europe ends and Asia commences at the end of the Landstrasse, Hauptstrasse in Vienna's 3rd district. Now, many have since surely agreed, others see Europe's end further east. But the point is clear. Belonging to Europe, whatever that means, is good and desired. Nobody wants to be excluded from Europe. Everybody wants to be defined and European. I would like to argue that this inclusion into and exclusion out of Europe only pertains to its eastern dimension, since arguably the Renaissance, when the West came to be construed as good associated with progress, liberty, and civilization, and the East with backwardness, despotism, barbarity, Asia, and the Orient. Indeed, one of the consequences of 1989 has been a whole movement in East Central Europe to return to Europe, to rejoin Europe, which one seems to have left, or better put, were forced to leave by communism and the Soviet occupation. Somehow the years between 1945 and 1989 seem to have de-Europeanized all those Europeans that were in the East, the bad and backward part of Europe. Hence, note the various nomenclatures that exist pertaining to this unclear region, all there for the sole purpose not to be called East European and not be included in Eastern Europe. There was, of course, and still exists, the Friedrich Naumann-based German term Mitteleuropa, with all its complex connotations, many quite negative, of course, in terms of connoting a German, quote, prosperity sphere. If you catch my drift here, I'm mixing fascist metaphors because obviously the Japanese talked about Asia as their co-prosperity sphere. Then there is the East Central Europe, which would be okay were there in fact a definitive West Central Europe, which of course there isn't, because once you are firmly perceived to be in the West Club, you need no qualifiers or of center, middle, left, right, Europe. It's just you're European, end of story. There's, of course, the perennial Central Europe, though who exactly belongs to it? Most folks would place the four former Visegrad countries of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary in the Central European category for sure. Remember, Visegrad was a big big to do about it, but completely faded. But what about Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia? Clearly, there's much more than geography that includes and excludes here. It is a mixed and amorphous amalgam of religion. Clearly, Catholics are somehow more central than Orthodox and Muslim, of external behavior. Serbs, of course, can never claim to be central, let alone Western, by dint of their having behaved so abominably in the post-Yugoslav wars. Of internal behavior, corruption indices, exercise of power by quasi or para or even counter-stated institutions and agents such as mafias and other non-officially stated, sanctioned by often state-tolerated public entities. Of development levels in terms of literacy, economy, modernity, of firmness and legitimacy of state institutions. All of these are part of this, whether you really are Western, Eastern, East Central, whatever. And sure enough, these Western, East Central European states have had a much more developed transition to liberal democracy in the past 20 years than their Eastern cousins. Thus, for example, in Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and East Germany, the former communist rulers exited very quickly where their Serbian, Bulgarian, and Romanian counterparts did not. In Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, these former communist parties rename and reinvent themselves quite speedily, change to a considerable degree, become sort of quasi-social democratic parties, though not totally, and become part of a robust democracy and are integrated as legitimate players into the fabric of their countries, as my colleague Anna Gemalabuse demonstrates so convincingly. Too bad Anna isn't here. But this is less the case with countries further east, though not to be fair, neither in the Czech Republic nor in Slovakia do the former communist parties really become robust players in their respective countries' democratic process, though actually for very different reasons in both. Indeed, I would argue that one of the most profound lacunae of legitimacy that communism suffered in its 40-plus years of existence in Eastern Europe was its being associated as decidedly non-European, with the crucial exception of the German Democratic Republic, where it was associated with its being not only profoundly European, but of course indeed deeply German. Perhaps the most important reason why communism, I would argue, as a set of ideas, of values, even of politics and policies, was not as much frowned upon in that country as it was in the rest of Eastern Europe. I would go so far as to state that by the middle of the 1970s, when I traveled quite extensively in this part of the world, actually the last time I really did do so extensively, the only real communists that I encountered, other than, of course, social scientists from Berkeley, Columbia, Berlin, LSE, Oxford, Michigan, of course. I actually literally never met any one intellectual ever, or student, or anybody dealing with any kind of ideas or whatever, who vaguely identified himself or herself as communist in either Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and even in Yugoslavia. Okay? A few apparatchiks lauded communism, but only before the second beer at night, after which they let loose and told you what they genuinely thought of communism. They all viewed it as a sham, a fraud, a complete failure, and worse. Actually, this 70s, I don't mean to, usually my predictions are always wrong, but I kind of came back at that time, the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and I remember we had this talk, Grzegorz Eckert, when I was saying, I think these guys are in trouble. I mean, they must, no one, it's amazing. No one believes in this. It's not like, you say, I don't, I'm a labor guy, I don't like the Tories, but the entire system was seen as risible. It's not only that it was dangerous, which it also was, but it was kind of, seen as a kind of a buffoonery of some sort. Of course, communism also gained legitimacy in East Germany by dint of its being the only viable product differentiation, if you permit me such a capitalist term, vis-à-vis West Germany, which was essential to the regime's national identity, that none of the other countries needed, since there was no richer and much more attractive West Poland, nor richer and more attractive West Hungary, nor West anything threatening the East Germans on the national dimensions the way West Germany decided it threatened them. I will say something more about nationalism a little later. I've always firmly believed the counterfactual maybe we'll have a big discussion on this, that had communism been brought to Europe by the Germans and not the Russians, its fate in the 20th century would have been very different and much more legitimate and accepted merely by its being identified by a Western agent. Indeed, National Socialism's greater public acceptance by Europeans than communism, which would have been much greater still had the German occupation not turned out to be as brutal as it was, has, in my view, everything to do with this West-East divide, with the former being regarded as superior and the latter inferior. Thus, I experienced what I have come to call the Markovits categorization of intra-European relations as a young child, and which I firmly believe to this very day. I always tell this to my students. Some of them believe it, others not. It goes somewhat like this. It's actually a fairly good compass of European relations. You dislike all your neighbors, but those to the east and the southeast you seriously disdain. Just do your map of Europe. I mean, I'm not sure whether the Portuguese disdain the Spaniards and the Irish clearly hate the British, but don't disdain them. But the point is that this Ostgefälle, this kind of falling of towards the east is just ubiquitous. I mean, even yesterday I met Zvi Gittleman, and we talked about that he was in some synagogue in, of course, the city of Lviv, or Lviv, which of course is Lvov and Lemberg. And some guy comes up to him, some Jewish guy, and says to him, you know, I went to this whatever Babelsberg Gymnasium or something, and you know, everything went downhill since actually they let these Ukrainians in. Okay? In other words, you know, when things were under the poles, you know, so it's the Markovits theory of Eastern Europe. I mean, let me give you another personal example. Here was my family, totally ravaged by the Holocaust. All four of my parents' murdered in Auschwitz. Many of their siblings and cousins and aunts and uncles too. My father and mother literally owed their lives to the presence of the Red Army that arrived in Timisoara before the Germans. And whom did I grow up hearing nothing good about in the midst of all this Grimm and Goethe and Schiller and Bach and Beethoven and whatever else, but of course the Russians. And the Soviets, obviously, they were non-European. In fact, until his dying day, my father always used the term Europäer, and we always spoke Hungarian with each other. And he never said Europäi, which would be the Hungarian, but the German Europäer as his highest form of accolade and compliment for civility, good taste, and high culture. I will never forget that just before he died in April of 1990, he called Nelson Mandela a real Europäer, as he, of course, had called President Kennedy when we stood in line 4 deep to see the arrival of the young president in 1961 at the Soviet embassy in Vienna's Reisnerstrasse, I remember it to this day, on his way to meeting the evil Nikita Khrushchev, who of course was anything but an Europäer for my father, but of some kind of Ukrainian, twice removed in the Markovits scale. I mean, just a bad news guy. I mean, and I also remember with what delight and in what awe he always uttered the words Nyugat, or Nyugati, which means West and Western in Hungarian, in his conversations about pretty much anything related to politics, culture, ethics, aesthetics, and public affairs, even sports, where it connoted fair play and gentlemanliness. It's interesting, for instance, later on when I visited in Vienna, he somehow didn't quite even accept the real gentlemanly behavior of soccer hooligans in Britain. This was somehow dismissed as some kind of an Eastern perversion or something. I also never forget the facial expressions and contemptuous hand gestures that accompanied his mentioning the terms Kelet and Keleti, East and Eastern. Of course, to my father, a Habsburg European, a Central European, if there ever was one, Europäer remained the ultimate accolade, but even Europe's West had become insufficient in terms of providing safety and succor and enlightenment and liberty and all the good things in life and politics after the Holocaust. That had become the sole bailiwick of an overseas transatlantic European West called the United States of America. It was okay to listen to Bach, but not okay to trust the Europäer anymore. I remember how my father and I listened to the radio broadcast of the World Cup final from the Wankdorf Stadion in Bern, Switzerland, between Hungary and West Germany in 1954. The Hungarians were, of course, the huge favorites, the great Arany Csapat, the golden team, with the likes of Grosic, Božic, Buzanski, Hidegkuti, Kocsis, Cibor, and of course the rotund major of the Hungarian army and ball wizard, Ferenc Öcsi Puskás. The Hungarians were the very first team ever to beat England on the island at home at Wembley. Not only beat, but humiliate them 6-3, 53. They had destroyed the likes of Brazil and Uruguay. They had beaten everybody in the world, including the Germans, by a score of 8-3 earlier in the tournament. The golden team was the pride of Hungarians, though not my father's. Of course he did not root for the Germans. Of course he was for neither, but he actually was for neither side. And all of 5.5 years old that I was, my father before the game sat me down and said that the only important thing that day for us, now to this day don't know who the us was. Was it us Jews, us Europeans, us Westerners? Unclear. The only important thing on that day to me, 5.5-year-old András, was the fact that this was the birthday of the United States of America. This was, of course, the introduction to me of the 4th of July, which indeed was the game when, was the day when this major game happened, which actually also plays a very, very important role in post-war German history and the normalization and so on and so forth. We can go into that. So here is this fascinating phenomenon happening in the middle of Timișoara, or should I call it Temesvar, maybe even Temesburg. I cannot elaborate here why the term Europe only conjures up positive notions and zero negativity in global discourse, other than in the crucial context, of course, of colonialism, where, of course, it invokes nothing but negative images, and why America, at best, stimulates very ambivalent associations. But I would place the crucial difference in the context of Europe as an entity not being identified with one overwhelming power, whereas America has most assuredly been precisely so, certainly throughout much of the 20th, all of the 20th century, which also means that the real existing Europa, Europe, remains much more elusive and amorphous than the real existing America. Henry Kissinger's famous request to be given one telephone number for Europe comes close to the crux of this essential difference between Europe's unblemished image and America's much more ambivalent one. It is easier to idealize elusive and vague players than real ones. After all, were one country in Europe to have become identified with the entire continent and share its name, I'm sure that the idea and concept of Europe would be similarly ambivalent, flawed, and even hated, as has been the case with America, which stands for a continent as well, but also in common parlance and general understanding, at least, for one country on that continent, and of course, not by chance, its most powerful one. Interestingly, by the way, the Germans are the only ones who very much insist on, of course, calling it US-Amerikanisch. So I'm going on the Wahlbeobachtungsreise, a trip organized by the German Academic Exchange Service to observe the last week of the German campaign with 15 other social scientists from all over the world. And I remember it asks for your citizenship. So I wrote Amerikanisch, and it came back US-Amerikanisch. It's okay. I mean, not even the French call it EU-Américain, last I looked. The fact that America, as Europe's creation, came to challenge the old dowager has a lot to do with this difference as well, but this will lead me too much into the topic of European anti-Americanism, on which I already spoke 4 years ago. I looked it up September 15, 2005, which then led to numerous publications that will most assuredly, I can tell you right now, this lecture will not lead to. The post-1989 shifts merely in terms of the number of new countries and new political sovereignties have been massive. Now add to this the completely altered political landscape. In the fall of 1989, all of these countries were governed by various forms and manifestations of a Marxism that owed its legacy to the Leninist heritage, in which I also include, actually, again, to be debated, the allegedly different Yugoslavia that varied from its neighbors only by virtue of having been spared the Stalinist variant of this Leninist compact. Sure, there were differences, indeed massive ones, between, say, the goulash communism of the Hungarians, led by the pragmatic János Kádár, which he commenced already in the early 1960s, on the one hand, and the quasi-Maoist lunacies of an Enver Hoxha-led regime in Albania. Between the relatively lax Polish version of this Leninism, at least, of course, until the arrival of the brutal military junta of the 1980s, and this relaxedness rendered so by repeated worker uprisings commenced in 1956 and then continued in the 1970s, culminating in Solidarność. Without any question, the single most popular and assuredly working class movement in this 40-year period of Leninist desolation and repression. After all, this was a real proletarian revolutionary revolt movement against an allegedly proletarian state. And then, of course, the megalomania of Ceausescu-ruled Romania, a bizarre mixture of family feudalism, despotism, with a fine dosage of modern 20th century totalitarianism. There were occasional moments of hope and respite, none more so than the ill-fated but valiant Prague Spring of '68. But on the whole, these were one-party-dominated dictatorships led by old men in ill-fitting gray suits and the drab apparatchik allies in the party bureaucracy, the armed forces, and pretty much every important decision-making body of state and society, which of course were totally intertwined. The only reason that these regimes existed was by dint of military power, either solely based on the home forces or in combination with Soviet troops. None of these regimes would have lasted any length of time without this military repression. Indeed, come 1989, they did not. From the Martians' macro vantage point, a single textbook on how these countries were governed and what politics in them was like would have sufficed for a relatively good understanding of their quotidian reality. This textbook, however, would have been quite deficient in informing our Martian about the meso and the micro differences among these countries, that in my opinion were the major vehicles why the macro layer of Leninism failed and was torn asunder 20 years ago today. Indeed, the question still haunts me and remains very much an open one for me. How Romanian was Romanian communism? How Polish was its counterpart in Poland? And how did this manifest itself in other countries? And I mean the communisms, not, of course, the national characteristic and nationalism to which I now turn. It was the force of nationalism, and that force alone, that altered the map and created one Germany, while giving us at least, at last count, 6 successor states to the former Yugoslavia, 7 if one includes Kosovo as an independent country, and quite possibly 8 or 9 if one looks at the reality on the ground in Bosnia, where Serbs really live in their country of their own, with Muslim Bosnians and Croat Bosnian co-citizens also living in ethnically very segregated entities. As to the countries that emerged from the former Soviet Union, all of them did so with national identity being their most salient raison d'etre, including even Belarus. What made this renewed manifestation of nationalism as the most important identity builder in the creation of sovereign countries so unique in this period was the paucity of violence that accompanied it, with the exception, and this is a huge exception, of course, of the Yugoslav situation, Romania, to be sure, Lithuania to some degree, and some post-Soviet areas like Moldova and Transnistria, but most notably, of course, the Caucasus region. I told you I don't know where the eastern part of Europe ends, so I decided to include the Caucasus region, in which Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Abkhazia, Ossetia have engaged in violence and continue to do so. And actually, of course, I did not include the amazing and brutal violence in Chechnya and Ingushetia, Ossetia, which of course can be classified as intra-Russian affairs. However, if one discounts all these, and by the way, you notice they're almost all in the eastern part of the world, in not the central, more kind of fancier part of the club, I did not engage in any serious historical analysis to test the uniqueness of this phenomenon, but my cursory knowledge of European history leads me to believe that such massive shifts in sovereignty and state creation were accompanied by a much greater amount of violence in the past than they were 20 years and following. To add further to this tectonic shift that rearranged the region, there are two completely new supranational players that have emerged and that were literally unthinkable 20 years ago today. I am, of course, speaking about the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I'm not sure which of the three following statements would have committed one to an insane asylum in September of 1989, but stating all three would most decidedly have done the job. One, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia will be independent countries. Two, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia will be full member countries of the European Union. And three, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia will be a part of NATO. Now, why did this really happen? Why did these regimes topple? And as an old social movement person, I always want to accord developments from below definitive pride of place. In other words, what people really do, go on the street. But then as a student and admirer of Theda Skocpol's work, I also believe that none of the below stuff matters if nothing develops from indeed above. Let me say something about from below. I really think that my earlier comments about the low legitimacy of anything communist emanating from the East explains quite a bit as to why Soviet-imposed communism was bound to be hated and thus fail. Add to this the persistence of local nationalism, and the formula for regime failure was high. In one of her many superb, here she is actually, one of her many superb works on all of this stuff, pre-1989, 1989, and post-1989. I can't believe it. We didn't rehearse this. In her, this wonderful superb, Anna Gemalabouste informs us about the immense staying power of mass pre-communist schooling, demonstrating conclusively, at least for me, that if you had a well-functioning education system and a relatively high level of literacy before the arrival of the Soviets, the latter simply had no chance of attaining any of the legitimacy, and the lack of legitimacy was absolutely inherent from what I described before. Anna writes, and emphatically, the communist exit is more likely to occur where the literacy preceded the onset of communism. The education system succeeded, often even despite itself, I would argue, to reinforce national pride, to solidify local ideological and cultural opposition to those Eastern foreigners, by extolling what the Poles call, and I again cannot pronounce bjedowieni, or pre-war, an adjective used to describe, again, Anna here, lost excellence in everything from buildings to scouting association to fruit preserves. I love this stuff about fruit preserves because my dear Aunt Monsi, who of course also deported to Auschwitz, very much part of this thing that I described about my parents, she also, of course, had nothing but disdain for everybody to the East, Markovits' theory of European politics. And she constantly complained to me, a little kid, that the preserves that she made pre-war, okay, were in fact obviously much more superior. So apparently even in Poland, fruit preserves must be some kind of a genuine discourse of antinomy to Soviet hegemony. Amazing. This sentiment, this huge deficit in legitimacy, was, I would say, ubiquitous to all of Eastern Europe. I remember distinctly in those 70s that I described before, bringing eyeglasses, all kinds of orders of eyeglasses to various folks in Hungary and Romania in the 1970s, even though I think in terms of eyeglass production, the Romanian and Hungarian local products were not so terrible. But it didn't matter. they were not Western. And this reminded me of Ulrich Plenzdorf's brilliant play, Die Leiden des jungen W., in which he tells the story in the argot of the GDR of the 1970s. It's really brilliant, which of course developed its own argot, its own language, about this young guy who, of course, identifies with his sort of teenage malaise with of course, the legendary Werther that, of course, Goethe semi-autobiographically described 150 years before him. And in this play, there's this amazing kind of monologue where he describes to the audience what real genes are, okay? And I never forget, he kind of points this out where they have to sit. The Hüfte, and it's brilliant, okay? And he says, that's the genes, okay? The ones that are produced here, no one worth his salt would ever look at or certainly wear as genes, even though prima facie they were probably not that bad. Of course, these regimes suffered mightily simply by dint of ruling over poorer countries and less prosperous economies that could not produce all the fancy genes that Levi's and others could. The West Germans called this economic difference and material envy alles Bananen. It's all about bananas. But it was much more than that. It was mainly the fact that regular folks felt that they had no exit and voice options, which meant that they withheld big time on their loyalty options to the regimes, which they saw as tainted by dint of their Easternness, again, as I mentioned before, thus their non-Europeanness, and by dint of their own nationalism kept alive and well functioning by the education system. But I fear that even though, as I told you, I am a social movement person and love to accord folks like this the real power, and even though as intellectuals we obviously identify massively with people like Havel and Michnik and Walesa, who of course was not an intellectual but the next best thing to us intellectuals, namely of course a real worker, I think the above weighs, alas, more heavily in what I said in terms of the Scotch Bowl as to why such momentous occasions happen as it did 20 years ago. Put differently, I'm quite convinced that I would not be giving this lecture here today, and we would not celebrate an anniversary were it not for Mikhail Gorbachev and the decision from above not to resist and not to call in the tanks. I still have no idea as to why this did not happen. As we know from Mary Sarot's very fine recent study, appropriately just called 1989, the Berlin Wall's opening was not planned at all, but was the immediate consequence of a bungled press conference by an East German official. It's probably one of the most salient points of contingency. You all know the great theory of the misstep theory of history by Mark Bloch, who of course says that the way we explain anything in any social event is by looking, of course, at structure. And the question is, how do we respond or how do we explain how a man goes up a mountain and falls to his death? He said, well, obviously we need structure. We have to explain the mountain, the weather, the guy, was he in good shape, bad shape, strong, why did he go? Then clearly we need an agency. We have to explain, you know, what were his motives, what did he do? But ultimately, contingency matters as well. And it may be that, of course, indeed it was a misstep. He falls in the abyss because it was a misstep. Now, clearly missteps don't happen in vacuum. They clearly happen on this mountain to this guy. So clearly, this guy, I forget the press attaché guy in 1989 who bungles this press conference and then it leads to the opening of the wall is obviously contingent, but it is in fact in the context of a structure and agency. In other words, it still continues to baffle me why the will to rule at all costs was abandoned by the leadership in Moscow and beyond. Although that varied from capital to capital, with some most decidedly willing to call in the tanks, had the Soviets approved of this, such as the East Germans, who, again, as we know, actually planned a Tiananmen-like repression against the demonstrators in Leipzig in October. Were the costs too high? If yes, how so? More important still, why were they so high? It seems quite obvious to me why communism never attained any legitimacy in Eastern Europe or East Central Europe or Central Europe, or again, I'm not going to go all these nomenclatures which are uncertain. But why did it also lack much legitimacy in the Soviet Union, where it had a much longer shelf life, where it was associated with the defeat of fascism, where it stood for becoming a global power, and was synonymous with a huge dose of nationalism? Was it in fact because of the latter, meaning that Russian nationalism was simply insufficient to create a workable umbrella for other Soviet peoples to identify with and actually like the regime? Or was it perhaps the opposite, in that the Russians could not abide seeing other nations and ethnicity get some respect and perks by the Soviets, as was certainly the case until the 1930s? In other words, did the Soviet Union and its communism also succumb to the immense and centrifugal powers of nationalism? After all the readings I have done on this topic, I still have no idea in terms of what ultimately led to these amazing chain of events. Now, where does this leave us? Let me start with a positive tally. Budapest has become Vienna's suburb and vice versa. I actually know quite a few people who live in one and commute to the other on a daily basis. Unbelievable. This is and great train. I mean, whoa, internet, you name it. Phenomenal. There are lots of exit options, and people take advantage of them. They can travel, and they do. And even if they do not, the knowledge that they could and do not live in a prison makes a huge difference. The increased exit option has also increased the voice and loyalty options considerably. I actually did a little bit of research for this, and I actually looked at some economic data for this talk. And it's clear that folks in this area have many more telephones, especially of the cell phone variety, and motor vehicles than they did even 10 years ago. They still lag behind many Western European countries. Thus, for example, Georgia and Latvia, with 549.5 and 532.2 television sets per 1,000, persons rank 15 and 19 in the world in 2007, with Malta, Germany, Finland, Luxembourg, Denmark, and France ahead of them, but also with Italy, Austria, Sweden, the UK, and the Netherlands behind them. And I will not bore you, because the numbers in the lecture are terribly boring. I also look at motor vehicles and GDP. It's quite clear that in terms of the GDP per capita, which is of course a very crude way of looking at whether how well you're doing, in this case actually the East Europeans are still quite a bit behind the West Europeans, although Slovenia with 18,674, and of course, longitudinally, many of them tripled their GDP per capita income since the 1990s. So people are materially better off today than they were 20 years ago, but are they happier? And this leads me to the negative side of things. I have no idea whether one can even measure a nation's, let alone a region's, happiness, but it's clear from following the politics of the region, however cursorily, that there are lots of malcontents there, just like everywhere else. Somehow we all assumed, I certainly did in my liberal Pollyannism, that once communism is gone and the Soviet Union imploded, nirvana was going to break out and last forever over this region. Actually, I did not believe in the Markovits theory of European relations until later. Okay? Such unrealistic expectations could only lead to disappointment and disillusionment. Of course, major conflicts arose from the get-go, but let us remember that with the aforementioned exceptions, when I talked about the violence, all the arising conflicts, many of them major, have been resolved peacefully. This is a substantial achievement that should not be minimized. But clearly any change, especially gigantic ones that happened in this region, causes dislocation, fear, disenchantment, and creates a major reservoir of what one could call counter-cosmopolitanism, to use Kwame Anthony Apia's apt term. A resentment of cosmopolitan forces, of modernization, of globalization, of Europeanization. Thus, in each of these countries, we see some sort of chauvinist, and I mean it in both senses of the term, force on the right that is, if not explicitly fascist, then certainly of the crypto or quasi variety, often extolling its predecessors from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s who were fascist. Even on the left, especially in its little reformed communist variety, but also others, including the aforementioned East German one, One can discern hostilities to cosmopolitanization and other forces that resemble the expressions associated with the right, thus fostering a kind of national Bolshevism, certainly in sentiment, if not necessarily as political parties or actual coalitions. And I would classify these as certainly negative and inimical. Let me conclude. This area that I could not define in the beginning, Mauritius smile, it's great. East Europe, whatever this uncertain something to the east, has been a semi-periphery for much of its historic existence. To the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, the Ottomans. In the 20th century, to Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, possibly the worst cores that one can imagine and what would wish for on any semi-periphery. That era is thankfully over, which we should celebrate unequivocally and emphatically. But now this region has become yet another semi-periphery, in this case to a Franco-German-led European Union. But being a semi-periphery does not mean that things are all bad. It all depends on what kind of legitimacy the core possesses among the semi-periphery's populace. And I would argue that the current core has a much greater legitimacy in Eastern Europe than any that preceded it, including the nostalgically vaunted and much invoked Habsburg Empire. Last time I looked, it was not the EU army that conquered Romania and Bulgaria and then forced its citizens to join this new entity as some form of vassals. An amazing experiment is afoot in Europe that has few, if any, historical precedents, namely the construction of a sovereign entity and authority, call it state building if you will, that is happening without one shot being fired. Given Europe's dreary history, this is progress beyond words and imagination. Thank you.
You can field your own questions.
Sure.
I assume, yeah, I would hope.
Go ahead.
First of all, I just want to say I enjoyed that immensely.
Thank you.
Second, I don't have any analytical point, but I do have a detail to add, which is in the last 10 days, newly released material from the Soviet archives. The Soviet archives are wonderful because I'm convinced that before they're empty, they will embarrass every hero of anti-communism that there was. The Soviet archives reveal that Margaret Thatcher went to Gorbachev just before the fall of the Berlin Wall and said, we do not want any adjustment to the integrity of the post-war boundaries. Margaret Thatcher, it turns out, was adamantly against the reunification of Germany to the point at which she tacitly endorsed Soviet force to prevent it. She wasn't quite as extreme about it as Mitterrand, who was actually offering to send French troops in with the Soviets under the guise of creating a joint military force to prevent against natural disasters, which is clearly what they viewed the reunification of Germany as. So I found it interesting listening to this, how you were saying that, you know, these new, all these changes in Eastern Europe caused this enormous dissatisfaction. It's pretty clear that there were a lot of vested interests in Western Europe as well, who actually had become quite comfortable with the condition that Eastern Europe was in by 1989. Does that seem correct?
I totally, I mean, I agree with you. I didn't know about this
very
recent discoveries. I'm not at all surprised. Yeah, actually, no further comment. Yes, hi.
Hi, Andy. One tiny observation in support of the Markovits theory, moving from Portugal to Spain. If my wife is to be believed, and she's an infallible authority on everything, most Portuguese start cringing when they travel from Portugal to Spain because the volume level goes up suddenly. Spaniards, from their perspective, seem incapable of communicating with each other except by shouting. So there's your disdain.
I'm thrilled. I mean, I love to hear empirical verification to my impeccable theory. It's wonderful. Apropos impeccable, I just got, it's a good day. Yeah, I got this letter from a retired emeritus professor of German at Yale University, who had apparently just read my book on anti-Americanism, in which I actually, in the preface, say that I was never given, of course, an A+ in the gymnasium, because, of course, I spoke Amerikanisch, which, of course, is inferior, right? So you have to speak, of course, British. And here was this Austrian English teacher, of course, spoke with a heavy Austrian accent, but he spoke British English, okay? So clearly, this was, and apparently, which I wish I had written me along before, he shows that, just to confirm, again, a nice, that at Heidelberg, they refused to appoint a professor of Anglistik in the 20s because indeed the guy had spent most of his time at Harvard and Yale. Okay? So clearly he was not, it was not British English. But so anyway, just as a minor aside. But I love the one about Portugal. Okay. Yes, sir.
I assume that there's a fair amount of private enterprise now in the countries that were formerly under communism.
Yes.
How has that business been capitalized, and how big have some of those companies gotten?
Well, some are actually, how the process, you want me to tell you that?
Who put the money, the investment in to get them up and running? The government must have owned everything before.
Yes.
How did business get out of the government's
hands
into the hands of private investors?
In the most varied of forms. Western investment by big Western companies. Skoda is owned by VW. Okay, so clearly a huge Western infusion. But also innovation of market forces that people started their own laundromats and whatever. Obviously, many of the beneficiaries, and again, I know a lot more about this than I do, but many of the beneficiaries initially were, of course, the old state bureaucrats, because, of course, they had the political wherewithal, they had the resources, they had the connections to indeed enter into this massive change into a market economy. So, in fact, former communist officials then kind of mutated often into wealthy capitalist entrepreneurs, okay? But, I would actually argue that given this amazing transition, which was actually unprecedented, we've never seen a transition from a state-run economy to a market economy like this. On the whole, of course, there were big problems and inflation and different, from one country to another. But on the whole, I think, again, as I started out in the beginning, it's almost, it's unimaginable how well it turned out. Okay? And again, that most of these countries are now in the European Union, which, of course, again, has problems and advantages. Obviously, as I said, there are tremendous dislocations, fears, and so on and so forth. But again, there also are this total desire to belong to Europe. As I started by saying, to rejoin Europe, okay, to be, because somehow the previous 40 years were really seen as de-Europeanizing. Okay. Yes?
At what age have you noticed in your discussions? Thank you. At what age do you notice, or have you noticed in your discussions, that people say, I can imagine myself in 10 years carrying an EU passport, and there are others who say, never going to happen, I'm not interested, don't want to. In other words, the seesaw between nationalism and those who might identify with something above that, how do you see those forces going forward, balancing out or developing?
I'm not quite sure. First of all, I'm not sure it's a choice. I mean, these are all independent country passports, which are EU passports, so I must say I've never heard. I mean, are you asking sort of the larger issue of how
do young people identify with the European
Oh,
Union?
I see.
More than their national states?
No,
Do you
no one.
notice this?
No one identifies more than with their national states. And above all, look, but that's not. I actually don't know the data on Eastern Europe. As I always say, I have never ever seen a European flag waved like this. Never. Okay. Other than in the Ryder Cup games against the United States. Okay. In other words, the EU flag today is a major source of political authority. So you go to Budapest or Vienna, there's the Austrian flag, there's the European flag. It clearly is a phenomenal sense of dual authority. But is it part of your heart? Do you wave it? No, except when in fact it becomes filled with a form of emotion and also sense of us versus them, in this case in sports, where the Europeans are in fact European. There are Irishmen and Englishmen, last time I looked, not so fond of each other, but in this case Irishmen, Englishmen, Swedes, Germans, okay, Spaniards playing as Europeans. So to your question, I think it's a very clear, on the emotive level, not close. But that's not close in France either, okay? And I'm not sure it ever will be close, certainly not in my lifetime. And maybe that's not even the enterprise. The enterprise is a form of state building that may or may not have an emotive dimension like this. I think it will not do that unless there are really Europe-wide elections and people really, you know, when you have a Finnish social democrat running in Europe for the European presidency and Spanish social democrats choose him over a Spanish Christian social or a Christian democrat. Not in my lifetime, maybe some of our young people here, but even that I don't think. But that's not, I don't think that that's the issue here. So the issue is that, you know, that there is a sense of first of all, a greater amount of prosperity, a sense of belonging, in the sense, again, of this Europeanness, not in an emotive sense, but kind of that we're now joined this, okay? You know, we're starting to, you know, go towards this club that I said always has open Eastern boundaries but never Western boundaries, okay? In other words, if my father were alive today, remember when I told you about this Europäer, okay? He would now include or be hopeful that in fact now Romanians also have a chance to become Europäer in his sense of the term. Okay? Yes, sir.
On your concept of Europäer, would you say that the non-communist Italians viewed the Italian communists as severely lacking in Europäer, and the French communists as well?
I actually,
Maybe.
no, actually no.
No?
No. Don't get me wrong. The cleavages between the communists and the non-communists, and of course even before Berlinguer and whatever, are huge. This is not a question of disliking your enemy or your political rival. No, I don't think that's the case. I'm, in fact, reasonably certain about that. I mean, I don't know whether there were ever any questions like that, but I would be reasonably certain that they would hate their guts, they would like to beat them, they might even like to outlaw them, they might call in the CIA to, you know, to help them lose an election, but that is not the same notion of being of this Markovits theory of disdaining, looking down on, that is the eastward drift that exists in Europe. Yes, Jen.
Okay, I also have two quick comments. The first being about the Markovits. I would like the Markovits theory. It's very elegant, and so one is tempted to love it, but in contrast to the person behind me, there was a recent poll taken in Portugal showing that a majority would like to join Spain rather than remain independent. And this, well, because Spain had been doing remarkably well. This is during the housing bubble, of course, and Portugal not so great. And the second comment is, I'm going to support it with data and anecdote. So I was in Budapest this summer, and my husband and I were taking a cab ride to Memento Park, and the cab driver was talking to us about changes since communism, and the one thing he iterated over and over was the rise in prices. Everything is so expensive, I can't afford a thing. And our data, that I'm writing a paper right now with John Jackson, and we're looking at Polish attitudes toward the EU and the evolution of these attitudes. And you see that despite the initial euphoria, there's been a souring toward the EU and then a change once again, except among older citizens. You see older generations are less likely to be supportive of the EU and more nostalgic for...
Fine, that's politics. I mean, when I talked about counter-cosmopolitanism at the end, I hope that covers that totally. I'm not saying they're all, this is, all, honey and apple pie and there are no conflicts. Of course there are. But I would take that opposition to the EU in all these countries any day about over the sense of delegitimation and the sense of, again, being not part of any kind of your fate in any way that existed basically between 1945 and 1989. I think in your data, I would really like to, for me to be convinced by this, and I'm not at all, you would have to show me that... By what? That they're disillusioned with the EU. Of course they're disillusioned. Everybody's disillusioned with the EU.
No, not everybody, just the old...
No, but I mean, in every country you have people who are disillusioned with the EU. That's just, that's not particular to Poland. That's, every European country you have this. And by the way, actually it's interesting also by age. Of course, older people are worried and so on. And I'm not surprised by this, but this is the normal life of politics. Okay, and this is, to me, a different form of disempowerment than existed prior to 1989. Yes.
Can I ask a question about, you were talking about this periphery versus semi-periphery versus center.
Yeah.
And as a paranoid Eastern European, right, I have to ask this question. How committed is this center to its periphery? Like, for instance, you mentioned in your talk a while back how you'd been committed to a mental institution had you said that Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia would have been in the EU, independent, and in NATO. And who was saying, I think Bismarck was saying, it's not worth, the Balkans are not worth one drop of German blood or one German grenadier, right?
Right.
Is Estonia? So I'm basically, the question I'm going for is, can a backlash happen? And
backlash by whom?
The East pushing back.
Oh, the East pushing back. I see.
So would I commit myself to a mental institution if I said that in 10 years maybe
it'll be Soviet again or Russian again?
Something else. Thanks.
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, just as like I would have not been in the business of prognostication in 1989, I actually don't see it for the simple reason that it is not even in Russia's interest to do that. It's much better in Russia's interest actually to engage in a lively business relationship with a Germany-led Eastern Europe. I don't see why they would. So I know my answer is no, but again, I don't have those kinds of imaginations. Okay.
There is one last question. Okay, over there.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks very much. I have kind of a similar question, but maybe you can indulge it a little bit. I was in Azerbaijan this summer and was really struck and unprepared for the wealth of comments I heard from all over the place about, is Azerbaijan Europe or not? Like, really? Are you? I had no idea that this was a question that the Azerbaijanis were debating actively, and I don't feel like a lot of people in Western Europe are actively debating whether or not Azerbaijan is in Europe. I think they would say no. But I'm wondering whether you could imagine circumstances under which Azerbaijan or the Caucasus or some of the farther eastern regions could get over their interest in being part of the EU and not kind of fantasize about it in the way that I saw many of them doing, and whether that story is simply as simple as economic development. If the Caucasus, say, pick up and do fine without needing EU support or EU involvement, then maybe they would stop fantasizing about it culturally and socially and other things like that, or whether it's something deeper and they wouldn't drop it.
Let me ask you a counter, guys. What's so bad about fantasizing about being Europe? I mean, as I said, this I told you, basically from the Renaissance on, this is not new. From the Renaissance on, there is this cleavage between West associated with progress, et cetera, and the East. I mean, I'm not, that's why, of course, belonging to the West is an open, everyone wants to be in this club. That's why I told you I'd love to talk about East Central Europe if there were a West Central Europe, but there is no West Central Europe because once you're in the West, you don't need any qualifiers. You just are, okay? So I'm actually, I mean, your question is if the Azerbaijanis ever become really wealthy, if they ever become Swedes, okay? Will they stop fantasizing about wanting to become Europäer, as I call it? I have no idea. First of all, I have no idea how long it would be for them to become Swedes or Danes or Luxembourgians, who are the richest in the world, actually. But secondly, I'm not sure whether that ipso facto is also something that would alleviate the fantasizing. Okay, the fantasizing is not only about wealth. The fantasizing is about a certain kind of culture, refinement, et cetera, okay? Which, by the way, of course, is very common to American elites as well. Everybody fantasizes about Europe, okay? In other words, it's the good. European facial, European this, European. In other words, it is a Mr. Big without teeth, okay? It doesn't kick, it's not brash. It would be brash, as I said, would it be identical or overlapping with one European country, okay? Now, this would not have been the case had it remained had the Germans continued their hegemony. Clearly, the Brits would have not liked Europe, or it would have been clearly the Huns and so on and so forth, but that's not the case. So I actually, A, don't think it's only a matter of economic well-being, and B, it's fantasizing about something quite nice and, on the whole, innocuous. Okay, it's not such a bad thing. Okay.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much for a great
Thank you.